The judge's voice thundered through the courtroom like a crack of thunder. "I will have you dragged out of this courtroom in chains. Do you have any idea who I am?" His words rattled the heavy mahogany walls and sent a visible tremor through the jury box. Yet the woman at the witness stand did not flinch. She leaned forward, the harsh fluorescent lights catching the icy resolve in her eyes. Her voice emerged as a chilling, razor-sharp whisper that sliced cleanly through the suffocating silence. "I know exactly who you are, Your Honor. The question is, do you remember who I am?" Judge Harlan Voss's gavel froze in midair. The blood drained from his face, leaving behind an ashen, terrified mask. In that single suspended instant, the apex predator of the Chicago legal system became the prey. The Dirksen Federal Courthouse rose in downtown Chicago like an imposing monolith of glass and steel, a modern fortress built to intimidate. It was a place where lives were shattered or saved every single day. But to Judge Harlan Voss, it was simply his kingdom. Every morning, as he strode through the polished marble corridors, the sharp clack of his Italian leather shoes announced his arrival. Crowds parted before him, bailiffs lowered their eyes, and junior attorneys whispered nervously in his wake, all of it feeding his towering ego. Harlan commanded absolute authority, not through respect, but through pure, unadulterated fear. He looked every bit the distinguished jurist, silver hair impeccably styled, suits custom-tailored in Milan beneath his robes, posture rigid with self-importance. Throughout the Illinois legal circuit, he was known as the executioner, a judge who handed down maximum sentences without a shred of remorse. He denied bail to struggling single mothers, mocked defendants who begged for leniency, and delivered rulings that were swift, brutal, and utterly devoid of empathy. Yet beneath that polished veneer of blind justice lay a rotting core of corruption so deep it would have shattered the very foundations of the state's legal system if exposed. Harlan Voss was not a self-made man. He was a bought man. For years, his meteoric rise had been quietly funded and fiercely protected by the Valenti crime syndicate and a tight-knit network of corrupt politicians. In exchange for favorable rulings, suppressed evidence, and conveniently dismissed charges against key syndicate members, his offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands had grown exponentially. He boasted a sprawling gated estate in Winnetka, a luxurious penthouse overlooking the icy waters of Lake Michigan, and a sense of absolute invincibility that blinded him to how fragile his empire truly was. On this particular morning, the air in courtroom 2544 hung thick with tension, carrying the faint scent of old paper, nervous sweat, and lemon polish. It was the preliminary hearing for a massive corporate embezzlement case involving the Vanguard Logistics Group, a sophisticated front company for the very people who padded Harlan's secret accounts. The defense attorneys, high-priced legal sharks with slicked-back hair and expensive briefcases, looked thoroughly relaxed, practically sharing inside jokes, secure in the knowledge that the judge was already in their pocket. The prosecution, led by an earnest but visibly exhausted assistant U.S. attorney named Julian Reed, looked defeated before the proceedings had even begun. Julian bore dark, heavy circles under his eyes from weeks spent chasing paper trails that seemed to evaporate into thin air. Harlan settled into his high-backed leather chair and adjusted his heavy black robes with theatrical flair. He surveyed the courtroom with the cold, dead eyes of a reptile assessing trapped prey. He already knew exactly how this day would end. He would sustain the defense's objections, strike the prosecution's key documents on manufactured technicalities, and ultimately dismiss the case for insufficient evidence. It was a script he had played out flawlessly many times before. "Court is now in session," the bailiff bellowed. "The Honorable Judge Harlan Voss presiding. All rise." Harlan waved a dismissive hand and allowed the room to sit. He leaned toward his microphone, savoring the absolute terrified silence that fell over the chamber. "Mr. Reed," he drawled, voice dripping with condescension. "I trust the prosecution has something more substantial to present today than the baseless conjecture that wasted my court's valuable time yesterday." Julian swallowed hard, hands trembling slightly as he shuffled his papers. "Your Honor, we have uncovered new, critical evidence. We have brought in an independent forensic auditor from the Department of Justice's Elite Financial Crimes Task Force. She has traced the missing Vanguard funds directly to several highly insulated shell companies." Harlan suppressed a condescending smirk. Another naive number cruncher. He had verbally destroyed dozens of them on the stand. "Very well," he sighed dramatically, rolling his eyes so the defense table could see his immense boredom. "Call your witness, Mr. Reed. Let us get this charade over with so we can move on to real casework." The prosecution calls Ms. Clara Bennett to the stand. The heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. Harlan did not bother to look up at first, far too busy adjusting the heavy gold Rolex beneath his sleeve. But as the rhythmic, confident click of heels echoed down the center aisle, a strange, inexplicable chill washed over the back of his neck. It was a primal, deeply buried instinct, the sudden shivering awareness that a predator had entered the room. Clara Bennett walked down the long aisle with the terrifying, unhurried grace of an apex predator circling trapped prey. She wore a perfectly tailored charcoal gray suit, her dark hair pulled back into a severe professional bun that left her sharp features entirely exposed. She carried no briefcase, no hastily scribbled notes, no nervous energy whatsoever. Her posture was ramrod straight, radiating absolute, unbreakable authority. And her eyes, piercing, icy, uncompromising blue, were locked dead onto the judge's bench, completely ignoring the sea of faces around her. As she approached the heavy wooden gate, Harlan finally deigned to look up. For a fraction of a second, his brain registered only a beautiful, formidable woman. But as she raised her right hand to take the oath, the lighting shifted, and her eyes met his directly. The temperature in the courtroom seemed to plummet. Harlan's heart performed a violent, erratic stutter in his chest. The air was abruptly sucked from his lungs. He knew those eyes. He knew the sharp, proud angle of her jaw. He had seen that exact, unwavering stare years earlier in a cold, echoing hallway. It could not be. The name Clara Bennett echoed in his skull like a tolling death bell. "Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?" the clerk asked. "I do," Clara said. Her voice was calm and melodic, yet layered with a cold, tempered steel that sent a fresh wave of blinding nausea crashing over Harlan. She took her seat at the witness stand and methodically adjusted the microphone. She did not look at the bewildered prosecutor. She did not look at the smirking defense attorneys. She simply stared, unblinking and unflinching, at the man trembling in the black robe. Harlan's hands began to shake violently. He quickly folded them and pressed them with all his body weight against the polished mahogany desk to hide the tremors. A bead of cold, clammy sweat broke out on his forehead and slid agonizingly slowly down his temple. Clara Bennett, the daughter of Elias Bennett, the ghost of the man he had destroyed. "Ms. Bennett," Julian began, totally unaware of the silent, catastrophic psychological warfare detonating just feet away. "Could you please state your qualifications for the record?" "I hold a master's degree in forensic accounting from Yale University, graduating summa laude," Clara stated, her crisp enunciation projecting clearly to every shadowed corner of the massive room. "I spent years as a senior auditor for the IRS Criminal Investigation Unit before being aggressively recruited by the Department of Justice's Anti-Corruption Division. I specialize in tracking dark money, offshore tax evasion, dismantling corporate shell networks, and prosecuting institutional racketeering. Every single word was a rusted nail driven slowly into Harlan's coffin. He felt intensely dizzy. The courtroom walls, lined with imposing oil-painted portraits of past judges, seemed to glare down at him in condemnation. He desperately needed a drink of water, yet he knew that if he reached for the crystal glass beside his gavel, his violently shaking hand would knock it over. And regarding the Vanguard logistics case, Julian continued, finally finding a scrap of confidence. What did your independent, federally mandated audit reveal? Objection! Marcus Hale, the lead defense attorney, shot up from his leather chair like he had been electrified. Your Honor, this witness was added to the roster at the absolute last moment. The prosecution is deliberately hiding the ball. We have not had adequate time to review her findings or her methodology. This is an unconstitutional ambush. Harlan's mouth was dry as dust. This was his way out. It was right there, handed to him on a silver platter. He could sustain the objection, strike her from the witness list, and throw her out of his courtroom under the guise of procedural fairness. He opened his mouth to speak, to assert his dominant authority. But as he met Clara's gaze once more, he found his vocal cords entirely paralyzed. She was not merely looking at him. She was dissecting him down to the marrow. A faint, knowing, almost pitying smile ghosted across her lips. A terrifying look that said, I dare you. Try to hide behind your little wooden hammer. Try to stop what is about to happen. Your Honor? Marcus prompted, his smug confidence faltering. Harlan forced his chest to expand, forcing air past the lump in his throat. Overruled, he croaked. His voice sounded remarkably weak, a pathetic, reedy rasp that shocked everyone in the room. He cleared his throat violently, trying to summon the booming voice of the executioner. I said, overruled, Mr. Hale. The witness may proceed. Marcus slowly sank back into his chair, exchanging a baffled, slightly panicked look with his co-counsel. Judge Voss never overruled them on Vanguard matters. Something was horribly wrong. Thank you, Your Honor, Clara said. The polite words tasted like pure poison in the air. As I was saying, my audit revealed that Vanguard Logistics is not a functioning corporate entity. It has no real employees, no actual freight manifests, and no physical assets. It is a sophisticated laundering node. But what is infinitely more fascinating is where the laundered money ultimately ended up. Tens of millions of dollars were systematically and cleanly funneled into the blind trusts of several highly placed public officials. The courtroom erupted into a low, scandalized murmur. Reporters in the back row sat up straight, instantly smelling blood in the water. Harlan gripped the sharp edges of his desk until his knuckles turned bone white. He was staring at a ghost, a phantom he had created years earlier out of pure greed, and she had crawled her way back to drag him down to hell. As Clara's clear, uncompromising voice rang through the courthouse, Harlan's mind violently snapped back to a freezing, sleet-covered evening years earlier. The memory was burned into his psyche with branding iron clarity, a dark, festering stain he had spent years trying to scrub away with expensive scotch, luxury vacations, and offshore millions. Back then, Harlan was not yet a judge. He was an ambitious, ruthless prosecutor, desperately angling for higher office. He had been handed a career-making, high-profile case, a massive municipal pension fund, the life savings of thousands of city workers, had been completely drained of nearly $40 million. The public was out for blood, protesting in the streets, and the media was permanently camped outside his office demanding a head on a pike. The true culprits were powerful men, aldermen, real estate developers, and syndicate bosses. Men who could guarantee Harlan's immediate rise if he protected them, and guarantee his swift, ruinous destruction if he did not. They desperately needed a scapegoat, and Harlan found the perfect tragic one in Elias Bennett. Elias was the senior accountant for the municipal pension fund. He was a quiet, meticulously honest man who wore tweed jackets and actually cared about the retirees he worked for. In fact, Elias had been the one to discover the glaring discrepancies in the ledgers. Believing in the justice system, he had come directly to Harlan seeking help, bringing heavy cardboard boxes of meticulous, handwritten ledgers and bank statements as irrefutable proof of the theft. Harlan remembered sitting in his cramped office, smelling the cheap coffee on Elias's breath. He had smiled his most reassuring, charismatic smile, firmly shaken the man's hand, and promised him, man to man, that he would protect him and take down the real thieves. That very night, Harlan personally fed Elias's original ledgers into a commercial shredder. In their place, using the immense resources of the corrupt men backing him, he fabricated a flawless, labyrinthine paper trail of forged wire transfers, dummy accounts in Elias's name, and falsified emails. He pinned the entire theft squarely on the shoulders of the innocent accountant. The ensuing trial had been an absolute slaughter. Harlan had been magnificent in his cruelty, pacing the courtroom like a caged tiger, painting Elias as a calculating mastermind of unprecedented greed, who had callously stolen the retirements of thousands of hardworking police officers and teachers. Elias, utterly bewildered, terrified, and betrayed, had taken the stand and begged the jury to believe him. He had looked at Harlan with raw, desperate tears streaming down his face, completely unable to comprehend the absolute sociopathic evil standing before him. Harlan pushed mercilessly for the absolute maximum sentence. Elias was convicted on all counts and sentenced to decades in the notoriously violent Metropolitan Correctional Center in Chicago. Not long into his sentence, Elias, a gentle, soft-spoken man who had never been in a fistfight in his entire life, was brutally beaten to death with a steel pipe in the prison laundry room. Officially, the warden deemed it a random, tragic act of gang violence. Unofficially, Harlan knew it was the syndicate tying up a loose end permanently. The day of Elias's conviction, Harlan had walked out of the courtroom feeling like an untouchable god. But as he stepped into the crowded hallway, he was confronted by Elias's devastated wife and young daughter. The wife was on her knees, sobbing uncontrollably, but the little girl was not crying. She had stood dead center in the corridor, forcing Harlan to stop. She stared up at him with icy, unblinking blue eyes. There were no tears, no childish tantrums, only a profound, terrifying, adult rage. She did not scream. She did not try to attack him. She simply looked right through him and whispered, "You lied. You killed him. I'm going to remember everything about you." Harlan had scoffed, muttered an insult, physically brushed past the child, and gone out to celebrate his promotion. Over the years, expensive wine and the luxurious lifestyle had dulled the memory. He forgot the mother's desperate face. He forgot Elias's pleading voice. But he never forgot the chilling, hollow stare of that young girl. Now, years later, that girl was a woman sitting only a few feet away, holding the very threads of his entire existence in her steady hands. "Ms. Bennett." Julian's voice pulled Harlan violently back to the present. The prosecutor looked suddenly energized. "You mentioned public officials. Can you name the specific individuals who received these laundered Vanguard funds?" "Objection!" Marcus Hale screamed, leaping up so fast he knocked his heavy leather chair backward. "Relevance, prejudice, Your Honor. This trial is strictly about Vanguard Logistics corporate tax filings, not a baseless fishing expedition into unnamed public officials. She is attempting to poison the jury pool." Harlan's heart pounded against his ribs like a trapped, panicked bird. He had to stop this. He had to shut her down right now. He could hold her in contempt, order the bailiffs to clear the courtroom, seal the transcripts, anything to stop the words he knew were coming. He raised his heavy wooden gavel, his hand trembling so violently it rattled against the sounding block. But as Clara slowly turned her head, her icy blue eyes locked onto his, pinning him to his chair. She did not speak a word, yet her expression was a deafening roar. Do it. Sustain the objection. Try to run. Try to use your fake authority. It won't save you this time. Harlan looked out at the gallery. It was packed with reporters from every major news outlet in Chicago. If he, a sitting judge, aggressively shut down testimony about corrupt officials protecting a known mob front, the optics would be disastrous. It would trigger an immediate federal inquiry anyway. He was trapped. She had meticulously built a perfectly constructed, inescapable snare. Overruled, he choked. The witness will answer the question. Marcus looked up at Harlan, as if the judge had suddenly grown a second head. He sank slowly to his knees to pick up his chair, realizing with dawning, sickening horror that his protective judicial shield had just evaporated. "Thank you, Your Honor," Clara said. She reached inside her tailored jacket and slowly pulled out a sleek black leather-bound ledger. Harlan's breath hitched audibly. It looked exactly, painfully exactly, like the ledgers her father used to carry into his office years earlier. "I have here the verified, unredacted bank records obtained via international subpoena from the Cayman Islands and the Bank of Geneva. The funds from Vanguard were routed through a shell company called Apex Holdings. The sole beneficiary of Apex Holdings is a man who has received over $12 million in untraceable offshore bribes over the years." "And who exactly is that man?" Julian asked, stepping away from his podium. The courtroom was so intensely quiet, you could hear the hum of the fluorescent lights and the ragged, shallow breathing coming from the judge's bench. Clara did not look at the prosecutor. She did not look at the jury box. She turned her entire body to face the elevated mahogany bench. The silence stretched until it felt like a physical, crushing weight pressing down on Harlan's chest. "The beneficiary," Clara said, her voice echoing off the wood-paneled walls with the finality of a guillotine dropping, "is sitting right in front of me, the Honorable Judge Harlan Voss." Absolute pandemonium. The courtroom exploded like a powder keg. Reporters in the back rows scrambled over the heavy wooden pews, shouting questions and frantically dialing their editors. The gallery erupted in gasps, shouts of disbelief, and furious murmurs. Marcus and his entire defense team jumped up, waving their arms frantically and screaming objections over the deafening din. Even Julian stood frozen, shell-shocked, his jaw unhinged. "Order!" Harlan screamed, his voice cracking hysterically. He slammed his gavel down repeatedly, the sound cracking like rapid gunshots. But his hands were shaking so violently, he nearly dropped the heavy wooden mallet entirely. "Order in this court! I demand silence! I will clear this room! I will hold every single one of you in contempt of federal court!" The noise slowly dialed down to an electrified, buzzing hum, but the tension was thick enough to choke on. Every single eye in the room was staring unblinkingly at Harlan. The once invincible executioner looked entirely, fundamentally, unhinged. His face was a mottled, unhealthy purple, a thick blue vein pulsing dangerously in the center of his forehead. "How dare you!" Harlan hissed, pointing a trembling, accusing finger at Clara, spit flying from his lips. "How absolutely dare you come into my sacred courtroom and utter such baseless, slanderous, defamatory lies? You are in contempt of court. Bailiff, take this insane woman into custody immediately." The bailiff, a burly man who had served loyally in Harlan's court for years, took a hesitant, uncertain step forward. He looked desperately torn between his sworn duty and the shocking, hyper-specific accusation he had just heard from a credentialed federal agent. "They aren't lies, Harlan," Clara said. She had dropped the title, Your Honor. That tiny, intentional omission of respect sent a secondary shockwave rippling through the room. "And I am not in contempt. I am here executing a federal warrant." "Warrant!" Harlan bellowed, his voice reaching a pitch of pure panic. "You have no jurisdiction here. I am a federal judge. I have absolute immunity. I demand to speak to the Attorney General this instant." "Account number 449-B at the Bank of Geneva," Clara continued, her voice cutting cleanly through his frantic screaming like a surgical blade. She opened the black ledger, tracing a line with her finger. "Opened years ago, mere days after you convicted an innocent man named Elias Bennett. The initial deposit was a lump sum of $2 million. The exact price for your soul, wasn't it?" Harlan collapsed backward into his leather chair, the remaining fight draining out of his body instantly. The mention of the exact account number and the precise timing told him everything. She did not merely have suspicions. She had it all. The impenetrable fortress he had built around himself had been constructed on sand. "You see?" Clara said, standing up smoothly from the witness chair. She stepped down into the well of the court, entirely ignoring the frantic, sputtering objections of the defense attorneys. "When you knowingly sent my father to a violent prison, you thought you buried the problem. But you only buried a seed. I spent years studying. I went to Yale. I became a forensic accountant. I joined the DOJ specifically to hunt down the systemic rot in this city's justice system. I didn't just look at the ledgers. I looked at the metadata, the offshore shell proxies, the encrypted routing numbers. And I started with you." "This is a vendetta!" Harlan yelled, desperation making his voice crack into a pathetic whine. He looked around the room, pleading with the silent crowd. "This is a personal psychotic vendetta by an unstable, grieving woman. Everything she says is fruit of the poisonous tree. It's inadmissible." "It is not a vendetta. It is a verified federal audit," Clara corrected sharply, her voice echoing with absolute authority. "And your books are wildly, criminally unbalanced. For years I have been tracing your dark money. Every bribe you took to dismiss a syndicate case, every payoff you received from the Valenti family to look the other way, every wire transfer you made to renovate your Winnetka estate. It is all right here." She stepped forward and slammed the heavy ledger down onto the prosecutor's table with a resounding thud. "Complete, unassailable, irrefutable proof of federal RICO violations, wire fraud, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy to commit capital murder." "Murder?" Julian gasped, finally finding his voice, his face pale. "My father did not die in a random prison fight," Clara said, her voice dropping to a dangerous, vibrating low octave. She walked right up to the elevated judge's bench, forcing Harlan to look down at her. The power dynamic in the room had completely and violently inverted. The man in the flowing black robes was physically shrinking, shriveling under her relentless gaze. "You ordered the hit to ensure he never filed an appeal and exposed your forged documents. You paid a corrupt prison guard $50,000 from a Cayman account to unlock the laundry room doors and look the other way. I tracked that payment too. I tracked the guard down. He cut a federal plea deal and gave you up, Harlan. He gave us everything." Harlan could not breathe. His vision blurred at the edges, tunneling until all he could see was Clara's face. The massive walls of his kingdom were violently crashing down around him, burying him in the rubble of his own arrogance. He looked around wildly, frantically searching for an escape route, a side door, anything. But before he could move, the heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom swung open once again. A dozen men and women wearing dark tactical windbreakers, emblazoned with the bright yellow letters FBI, poured into the courtroom. They moved with swift, overwhelming tactical precision, fanning out across the back walls and securing all the exits. The lead agent, a tall, grim-faced man with graying temples, walked straight down the center aisle. "What is the meaning of this?" Harlan managed to squeak, frantically attempting to pull the remnants of his judicial authority around him like a protective blanket, though everyone in the room now knew it was nothing more than a tattered, blood-stained rag. "Judge Harlan Voss," the lead agent said loudly, stepping directly up to the bench and flashing a gold shield that caught the fluorescent light. "You are under arrest for federal racketeering, wire fraud, conspiracy, and the premeditated murder of Elias Bennett. We have a signed warrant to seize all your physical assets, freeze your global accounts, and remand you immediately into federal custody without bail." "You can't arrest me in my own courtroom!" Harlan screamed, standing up so fast his heavy leather chair crashed backward against the mahogany wall. He was hyperventilating now, panic fully taking over. "I have immunity! I demand my phone! I demand to speak to the Attorney General!" "The Attorney General is the one who signed the warrant," Clara said softly from the floor, her voice a calm counterpoint to his hysteria. Harlan looked down at her. For the first true time in his miserable life, he felt pure, paralyzing, existential terror. Staring at her, the years stripped away. He saw the young girl in the hallway standing triumphant over the smoking ruins of his life. She had not merely defeated him. She had utterly and totally annihilated him. She had taken his pristine reputation, his stolen wealth, his cherished freedom, and his historical legacy, and shattered them into a million unrecoverable pieces. "Put your hands behind your back, Mr. Voss," the FBI agent ordered, his tone leaving no room for argument. Two heavily armed agents flanked the elevated bench. They did not treat him with the polite deference usually afforded to a judge. They grabbed his arms roughly, forcefully pulling them behind his back. The sharp metallic ratcheting click of steel handcuffs echoed loudly through the dead silent courtroom. To Harlan, it was the loudest, most terrifying sound he had ever heard in his life. It sounded exactly like the final, definitive strike of a gavel. "You ruined my life," Harlan hissed venomously, spittle hitting his chin as they marched him down the steps from his high bench. "You vindictive little—" "I simply balanced the ledger," Clara interrupted smoothly, stepping out of his path. Her face was a mask of profound, unbreakable calm. "You built a mansion on my father's grave, Harlan. I'm just bringing the wrecking ball." As they paraded him through the well of the court, the reporters in the gallery went absolutely feral. Dozens of camera flashes blinded him, capturing his humiliated purple face and the cuffs biting into his wrists. Questions were screamed at him from every direction, a chaotic chorus of condemnation. The mighty, untouchable executioner was frog-marched down the center aisle, his expensive, custom-tailored black robes tangling awkwardly around his legs, making him stumble clumsily like a drunkard. Clara stood entirely still, watching him go. She did not smile. There was no triumphant cheering, no gloating. There was only a deep, settling, profound peace. The heavy, suffocating weight she had carried in her chest for years finally lifted from her shoulders. She looked up at the empty leather chair behind the grand bench, the symbol of absolute power that had been hollowed out and exposed for the rot it truly was. "Court is adjourned," Clara whispered softly to the empty room. The catastrophic fall of Judge Harlan Voss was absolute, swift, and entirely merciless. It dominated the national news cycle for months. The media tore him apart piece by piece, exposing every lavish detail of the luxurious, arrogant life he had funded with blood money. The public outrage was so intense, with daily protests outside the courthouse, that the state governor was forced to publicly condemn him on live television. The Valenti Syndicate, realizing instantly that Harlan was now a massive, toxic liability, entirely abandoned him, taking all their high-priced lawyers and dark money with them. His trial was brutally swift. Stripped of his offshore millions, his political connections, and his immense power, he was represented by an overworked, underpaid public defender who visibly despised him for the stain he had left on their profession. Clara Bennett sat dead center in the front row of the gallery every single day of the proceedings. She did not have to testify again. Her exhaustive forensic report and the damning testimonies of the corrupt officials and prison guards she had flipped were more than enough to bury him. She just sat there, a quiet, unmoving, silent sentinel, watching karma do its brutal, unyielding work. When the jury returned with a guilty verdict on all counts after only a short time of deliberation, Harlan did not react. He sat slumped at the defense table, a hollowed-out, pathetic husk of a man. Within months, his perfectly styled silver hair had turned entirely white and thinned out. The arrogant, untouchable sneer was gone forever, permanently replaced by a mask of wide-eyed, twitching terror. The presiding judge, a younger colleague Harlan had once mercilessly bullied, belittled, and passed over for promotion, looked down at him with utter disgust and showed zero mercy. Harlan Voss was sentenced to life in federal prison without the slimmest possibility of parole. But the universe and karma were not quite finished with him. Due to the incredibly high-profile nature of his crimes, his intimate knowledge of the syndicate, and his former status as a judge who had sentenced thousands of violent offenders, the Bureau of Prisons had a difficult time finding a secure facility for him. They ultimately sent him to the only maximum security federal penitentiary in the region, equipped with a specialized high-security wing. Shortly thereafter, the heavy rusted iron doors of the Metropolitan Correctional Center in Chicago slammed violently shut behind Harlan Voss. He was aggressively stripped of his remaining dignity and handed a scratchy, stiff, oversized orange jumpsuit that smelled of bleach and old sweat. As the guards marched him down the long, echoing, dimly lit concrete corridor toward cell block C, the sounds began. The inmates, sensing fresh meat, began to bang their plastic cups rhythmically against the steel bars. Word had traveled incredibly fast through the prison grapevine. The executioner was in the house. The arrogant man who had smugly handed out thousands of years in cruel maximum sentences was now permanently trapped in the very cage he loved to throw broken people into. Harlan's legs gave out completely, and he stumbled heavily against the freezing, damp concrete wall. He looked left and right into the dark, cramped cells, seeing the dead, violent eyes of the men staring back at him. Men he had put there, men who remembered his face, his gavel, and his cruel smirk. "Keep moving, inmate," the guard barked harshly, shoving a baton forcefully into Harlan's back. As Harlan was thrown roughly into his tiny, bleak cell, the heavy iron bars sliding shut with a sickening final clang that rattled his teeth, he collapsed onto the paper-thin, stained mattress. He pulled his trembling knees tightly to his chest, shaking uncontrollably, wrapping his arms around his legs in a desperate attempt to feel safe. He looked up at the small, barred window near the ceiling, letting in only a pathetic, gray sliver of cold Chicago light. It was in that miserable, terrifying, echoing silence, smelling the stench of rust and despair, that the ultimate crushing weight of his karma finally broke him. He realized with absolute soul-shattering certainty that he would die in this horrible building. He would die in the exact same cold, unforgiving prison where he had sent an innocent Elias Bennett to die years earlier. The brutal circle was complete. The massive ledger of his life was finally balanced to zero. The executioner had officially become the condemned. Miles away, in a quiet, sunlit federal office overlooking the sprawling Chicago skyline and the glistening blue waters of the lake, Clara Bennett closed a massive, heavy file folder labeled, "Done, Harlan." She slid it carefully into a steel drawer, locked it with a definitive click, and walked over to the large glass window. The city looked somehow cleaner today. The shadows were a little less dark. The oppressive, overarching shadow of the gavel was finally gone. She reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a small, tarnished silver pocket watch, her father's watch, recovered from evidence. She polished the warm silver with her thumb, feeling the steady, reliable tick of the hands inside. She smiled softly, a genuine smile that reached her bright blue eyes, and walked out into the warm, waiting sunlight. What did you think of Judge Harlan Voss's ultimate, terrifying downfall? Karma always keeps a meticulous ledger, and no matter how high you climb on a fragile ladder of lies and corruption, the crushing fall is always waiting for you at the end. If this gripping story of poetic justice, deep, dark secrets, and brilliant courtroom revenge kept you on the edge of your seat, please do me a massive favor. Hit that like button to show your support. Share this video with your friends and family who love a good mystery. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Make sure you absolutely smash that notification bell so you never miss out on our thrilling daily tales of drama, suspense, and ultimate revenge. Drop a comment below and let's discuss. Would you have possessed the incredible patience to wait years to exact your perfect revenge like Clara did? Or would you have handled the corrupt judge differently? Could you have kept your composure on that witness stand? We love reading and replying to your thoughts. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next gripping story.